Gonzaga's non-conference schedule is almost finalized. We discussed the two most recent games added to the docket and why we haven't seen the full schedule just yet, all on today's Locked On Zags podcast.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 back in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. Folks, it's a scheduling day today. We're going to take a look at Gonzaga's current non-conference schedule, including their two most recent additions to the schedule, what's left to be added, some speculation on who those final teams might be. And then we're going to close out the show diving into my preferred non-conference schedule as a mailbag question here on Monday, discussing who I would love to see in my ideal non-conference schedule. We'll get to that momentarily. But for right now, Gonzaga has finalized, they have not finalized, but they have added two more games to their non-conference schedule. We're going to talk about Cal State, Bakersfield, and Jackson State, the two new games on the docket. Bakersfield is going to be played on November 28th. It'll be a home game. Both these games are going to be played at the McCarthy Athletic Center. Cal State Bakersfield out of the Big West Conference. This will be Gonzaga's first game back from the Maui Invitational. We talked about this last week. Maui will still be played in Hawaii. It is going to be played in Honolulu instead of at the Lahaina Civic Center in Maui, where the tournament has traditionally been held because of all of the wildfire relief efforts happening down there. But this game will happen after they get back from Maui, after they play through that gauntlet of games in that Maui Invitational. They'll play Cal State Bakersfield on the 28th of November, a few days before they head down to Las Vegas to take on USC, scheduled for December 2nd. Bakersfield's not a particularly good team. This is one of the tune-up games on Gonzaga's schedule. They always have 4 or 5 different kind of opponents that tend to not present much of a challenge. They kind of have broken up Gonzaga's non-con into super marquee opponents like UConn and Kentucky, and then the tune-up game style like Bakersfield and Jackson State. And then there tends to be a few games in the middle. I always consider Washington kind of in the middle this year. Yale is a very good mid-major team. I don't feel like a tune-up necessarily, but they're certainly not a marquee opponent, so kind of right in the middle. But Bakersfield definitely represents a team that Gonzaga shouldn't have much trouble with. They're 4-0 against them historically. This team went 6-14 in the Big West last year, 11-22 overall. The Zags are 4-0 against them all time, and I suspect we'll probably be 5-0 against them all time by the time December rolls around of this year. And then the Zags have Jackson State on the 20th of December. Again, another tune-up game. These games, probably the last game before Gonzaga embarks on Christmas break. They have this game, and then they have a game scheduled on the 29th of December against San Diego State. They'll play UConn on the 15th, so this is kind of the game breaking up those two games. Again, there may be a game that gets added between the 20th and the 29th. That's a 9-day break, but again, it is over Christmas break, and the Zags have always kind of tried to give the team a little bit of a longer break at that period of time, so this might be the final game before Gonzaga goes on that Christmas break. Jackson State, like so many teams in the SWAC, is a team that plays a ridiculous loaded non-conference schedule, but does pretty well in conference. Last year, Jackson State went 14-19 overall, but they went 12-6 in the SWAC, which means they went 2-13 in their non-conference slate. That's kind of what you expect to see from teams that schedule these kind of games. It's a good way for them to make some added money. They are coached by former NBA player Mo Williams. It is the not alma mater, but the school that Deion Sanders coached at before coaching at Colorado. So an HBCU program that has a little bit of momentum from an athletic standpoint, but still represents a nice kind of tune-up game for Gonzaga between that UConn game in Seattle and that San Diego State game at the McCarthy Athletic Center. So right now the Zags have scheduled 12 of their 14 non-conference games. And I say 14, they don't technically have to schedule all of them, and they may not. Right now, Gonzaga is one of the last teams to release their non-conference schedule. Most teams in college basketball have released their full schedule. In fact, the way we found out about Cal State Bakersfield is because Cal State Bakersfield released their non-conference schedule. Gonzaga was on it. Oh, that means we can piece it together that the Zags are going to play Cal State Bakersfield next year. But Gonzaga has historically been one of the later teams to release their non-conference schedule. It does seem odd that as I'm recording this on September 17th, as you're listening to this likely on September 18th, the Zags have not finalized their non-conference schedule. This is pretty late. I will admit that. But it's not uncommon for Gonzaga to be among the latest teams to do that. I don't know exactly why, whether it's because Mark Few really likes to tinker with that schedule, if there is any other particular reason. But right now we know 12 of the games that are scheduled. We know the exhibition game, or at least one of the exhibition games. So I'll go through quickly what we have, what might be coming. We know Gonzaga's got an exhibition game against Lewis Clark State scheduled for November 3rd. They could schedule another exhibition game, or they could play a non-Division I game during the season, like they did last season with Eastern Oregon, who they played on December 28th. After that exhibition game on the 3rd, 7 days later, they will play Yale at home on November 10th, their first home regular season game of the season. Yale won 21 games last year. Very quality Ivy League program. After that, there's a 10-game gap between the 10th and the 20th, which is when they start that Maui Invitational against Purdue, is who they are opening up with in Maui. Or I guess it'll be in Honolulu in the Maui Invitational. They will play Purdue first. Then after that, they will play either Tennessee or Syracuse, depending on who wins that game, depending on who wins the Gonzaga-Purdue game. And then after that, they will play one of the 4 following teams, either Kansas or Marquette or UCLA or Chaminade. Barring 2 losses, Gonzaga should end up getting 3 really quality opponents out of this. Hopefully it is something like Purdue and Tennessee and Kansas. That would be the ideal situation for Gonzaga to play those 3 teams. But really, UCLA is fantastic. Marquette's fantastic. Syracuse is a team that I think is going to end up ranked at some point this year. This is an incredibly loaded Maui Invitational, and Gonzaga is almost certainly going to get 3 really quality opponents out of this tournament. Return from Maui, they play Bakersfield, like we said, at home on the 28th. After that, they will play USC, the Trojans, in Las Vegas on December 2nd. As I'm recording this, the venue for that game has not been finalized, but it should be a fantastic matchup. I suspect that Bronny James will not play in that game as he is recovering from a cardiac event that happened to him earlier in the summer. It sounds like he is going to make a recovery and should be able to resume basketball activities, but December 2nd is pretty early for him to make his return. We will see if he ends up playing in that one. Week later, the Zags got another Pac-12 opponent in Washington. They are playing that game in Seattle this year, part of that lengthy home and home series. This actually finalizes the 4-year home and home series that they agreed to 4 years ago. We'll see if Mark Few and Mike Hopkins decide to renew that rivalry going forward. 2 days later, the Zags got Mississippi Valley State at home, another opponent coming out of the SWAC conference, traditionally made up of those historically black colleges and universities. Mississippi Valley State was 4-14 last year in the SWAC, so this should be a nice tune-up game for them, because 4 days after that, they got UConn. Back to Seattle. They'll go to Seattle for UW, back to Spokane for Mississippi Valley State, then back across I-90 to play UConn in the battle in Seattle. Return game will be at Madison Square Garden the 24-25 season, a really fun 2-year series between these 2 squads. 5 days later, on December 20th, the Zags will host Jackson State, like we talked about. Then they get that 9-game break before they host again San Diego State. This should be a really fun start to a 2-year series between the Aztecs and the Zags, 2 of the best basketball programs on the West Coast. Not best mid-major, just best pure basketball programs on the West Coast. I'm very excited that these 2 teams are going to start playing each other regularly. Gonzaga's final non-conference game on the schedule will be against John Calipari and the Kentucky Wildcats. That game is scheduled for February 10th. They will play at Rupp Arena in Lexington, Kentucky, a mid-regular season game for Gonzaga. Very fun to have these back, in part because BYU has left the WCC. The Zags have a little bit more freedom to schedule a non-conference game during the traditional WCC season, and it's fun. They'll get a chance to play Kentucky. So we got 2 games left to be scheduled. Again, Gonzaga does not have to fill every single game, so they may not schedule 2 more games, but I suspect we will probably see 2 more opponents put on the schedule at some point. There's a 10-day gap between that Yale game on November 10th and the start of Maui on November 20th. So I have a feeling that we're missing a game there. I think there's going to be a game on like the 14th or 15th or 16th of November that has not been finalized yet for whatever reason. If I knew why, I promise I would tell you. I just don't know if there is a specific reason that schedule has not come out yet, but it wouldn't surprise me to see potentially even a quality opponent. Gonzaga already has a handful of those gimme games on the schedule with Mississippi Valley State, with Jackson State, with Bakersfield. And so I think there's a chance that Gonzaga could squeeze in a pretty decent opponent in that gap. There's also a 9-day gap between that Jackson State game on the 20th of December and that San Diego State game on the 29th. But again, that 9-day gap encompasses the Christmas break, which Gonzaga has traditionally tried to give their team a decent gap in order to be able to spend some time with family. So I'm not sure what is kind of the holdup here with Gonzaga's schedule. I suspect we'll have a final schedule from this team very soon, whether they're adding an NAIA opponent instead of a second exhibition game, which strikes me as possible, whether they are still waiting to hear from potentially a marquee opponent who hasn't finalized their non-conference to find a game in early November. Still some things that we haven't quite ironed out, but so far, I think it's hard to not like what Gonzaga has with this schedule and some really fun opponents like Kentucky and San Diego State and UConn and the Maui Invitational and Washington, of course, and USC. I think it's a really fun schedule for Gonzaga, and I'm excited to see how this all shakes out for them. Well, while I like this non-conference schedule, I did get a mailbag question asking about creating a non-conference schedule for Gonzaga if it was up to me, and that's what we're going to talk about to close out the show in the second and third segments, all coming up after a word from today's sponsor, Betterhelp. Folks, do you ever find yourself that you're trying to fall asleep, but your brain just suddenly won't stop talking to you? Do your thoughts racing right before bed or other inopportune moments? It turns out one great way to make those racing thoughts go away is to talk them through. Therapy gives you a place to do that so that you can get out of your negative thought cycles and find some mental and emotional peace. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Get a break from your thoughts with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedoncollege today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedoncollege. Folks, want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen or your first watch of the day. Shout out to those everyday listeners checking out the show on YouTube. We got more fun stuff coming your way later this week. We'll continue to keep you updated on Gonzaga's schedule as we learn more about who they're going to play this upcoming season. We got some fun guests lined up as well, and we're going to get started on our player preview series for this upcoming season very soon. For now, though, we're taking a mailbag question here. This question comes from Eva on Discord. For those of you who have not checked out the Discord channel yet, there is a link in your show notes or on YouTube to click. You can join. It's free. We're discussing Zags all day long, 24/7 on this channel. Definitely check it out if you have not done so yet. This was a question, again, from Eva, based on a post that was on the the college basketball subreddit on Reddit, basically saying if you could create your team's non-conference schedule, who would you pick and why? And I really wanted to take this. So I picked 12 games because I think that Gonzaga would, in theory, have an MTE, a multi-team event, as they do every year. And I wanted to pick 12 games. We'll talk about 6 of them in this segment, 6 of them to close out the show in the final segment. And I tried to be a little bit more realistic. It would be easy to be like, well, if I was picking Gonzaga's schedule, they would play Duke and they would play North Carolina and Kansas and Kentucky and UConn and Marquette or whatever, and just pick like the 12 best teams in college basketball. But A, that's not realistic. And B, I don't know that that's necessarily what you want. The tune-up games are important. And I think some people think Gonzaga's schedule leans a little too far into the tune-up games. And I think there's an argument there, pros and cons. I think it's reasonable to see both sides of that. But I do think that Gonzaga needs some of those games to get opportunities to maybe try guys at different positions, try different offensive sets they haven't run before, try different defenses, whatever it may be, and really just to get some of those bench players more opportunities. If you play 12 marquee games, you're not necessarily going to figure out who your fourth string center is, or whatever it may be, your fourth big. So I think that having games mixed in that give Gonzaga those opportunities is valuable. So here's my 12-game non-conference ideal schedule made by yours truly. And I tried to go in the order that I would actually play these games, but I wouldn't take that ultimately too seriously. I led off with Eastern Washington. Eastern Washington in the Big Sky Conference, of course, located in Cheney, Washington. Game would be played in early November as their opening game. I think this should kind of always be Gonzaga's opener. I think it would be so fantastic. And I know it's not going to happen every year, but I think routinely starting the college basketball season against Eastern Washington is a great way to go. It honors the Inland Northwest. It kind of gets the entire region excited about college basketball. It's a great regional rivalry, and it serves as a good kind of barometer for how Gonzaga is. I don't like, I know I use the term tune-up game, but Eastern Washington is a very good Big Sky program. This is a clear NCAA tournament capable program most seasons. David Riley is a fantastic coach, and that program is going in a positive direction. I think this is a great first game for Gonzaga to have that tune-up game, to experience playing a quality opponent, a regional opponent, get the area excited about basketball, but not necessarily be a game that Gonzaga is in extreme danger of losing. Number two, let's stick with the region, right? You're going to see a theme as we go through these 12 games. I think Gonzaga should always play more local regional rivalries. And if we're going to play a tune-up style game against a team in the Inland Northwest, let's play a slightly better version of that in Washington State. So for me, number two is the Cougars of Washington State. Played this game in early November as well. A more recognizable brand, certainly a Power 5 program for now. We'll see how that all shakes out with them and the potential merger or reverse merger with the Mountain West Conference. It's possible Washington State and Gonzaga end up being in the same conference in the not too distant future, which would alter this plan for me. But for me, Gonzaga and Washington State is a game that should be happening. I'm sad that that Gonzaga chose not to continue playing this game. I think having it go forward as a continued non-conference game for them is a good strategy. At this point, I think you want to start playing some of the big boys. And for me, I would love to see Gonzaga continue to play Creighton. I think Creighton is a fantastic non-conference opponent for Gonzaga. It's a similar school, a Jesuit Catholic institution, located in not necessarily a big media market. Creighton comes out of Nebraska, of course, a program that is perennially in the top 15, top 20, often in the top 10. Program that had a 3 seed last year, just missed going back to the Elite Eight. There's some history between these two programs, none more prevalent than right now, with Ryan Nembhard starting his junior season of college at Gonzaga after spending his first 2 years with those Blue Jays. Grant Gibbs transferred from Gonzaga to Creighton, so there's already some history. They've played each other in the NCAA tournament. They've played each other in regular season games. I think Gonzaga and Creighton is the kind of game that I would like to continue to see for the Zags. Next up, Duke. Give me the Blue Devils every single year. I started this list with Duke because there's no possible way that I wouldn't create my dream non-conference schedule for Gonzaga without them playing the bluest blue blood that exists. Krzyzewski's gone, but John Shire has that program in great shape. This is a team that's probably going to be the preseason number 1 or number 2 team in the country heading into this year. Kyle Filipowski's back. Tyrese Proctor's back. This is a really solid program every single year. Would love to bring him to the kennel. Boy, howdy, would I love to bring him to the kennel, but if I got to settle for playing at the Madison Square Garden, I'm good with that too. I think it's so much fun for Gonzaga to get an opportunity to play Duke, and if I was creating the schedule, you bet that they would be on it. 2 more here before we get into the third and final segment. Again, if we were playing these games in order, you got Creighton and Duke back to back. You're probably going to want a tune-up game before you get into the rest of your meat of your schedule. This is probably the least surprising game on there for those of you who are longtime or everyday listeners to the show. You know that I am an alumni from Gonzaga, but I am also an alumni from SeattleU. Graduated from SeattleU in 2015. Go Red Hawks. Big fan of that program. And frankly, I think Gonzaga and SeattleU should be playing each other. Not just because of my allegiance, which I've admitted a handful of times on the show, but they are 2 Jesuit Catholic small institutions in the state of Washington. No, SeattleU is not as good as Gonzaga. No, they are not particularly close to being as good as Gonzaga. But they are better than a lot of the programs that Gonzaga plays in their non-conference schedule. And I think this is a game that deserves to happen. SeattleU deserves to get a chance to play Gonzaga. Gonzaga should reward them with this game. That's how I feel. And I'm not, I don't think it's a huge deal that they don't, but I think it would be good. I think it's a game that would be good for the state. It would be good to see those matchups. As you can probably already guess here, we have Eastern Washington, we have Washington State, we have SeattleU. You guys can probably guess what one of the final games is going to be here. I think playing the Washington schools is a good idea for Gonzaga just in terms of building up those kind of regional rivalries. But SeattleU is a quality program. They finished fourth in the WAC last year, had a real chance to win that entire league. Chris Victor's a fantastic coach. And no, they're not going to necessarily challenge Gonzaga very many years, but I think they represent a step above some of those kind of those tune-up games that Gonzaga has played historically. I think they're slightly better than some of those opponents. And I think the regional aspect, whether they played in Spokane or whether they played at Climate Pledge Arena, where Seattle plays some home games there. I don't think that a game between Gonzaga and SeattleU would look like a home game for the Redhawks necessarily, but I think it'd be fun for those two teams to play each other in that situation. And then again, we will get to Washington later in the show. Spoiler alert for those of you who are still listening, but I wanted to mention another kind of regional game that I think makes sense for Gonzaga, and that's the Broncos of Boise State. Leon Rice, former longtime Gonzaga assistant coach, now the head coach for the Boise State Broncos, got extended through 2027, I believe, has done a fantastic job with that team, led them to the NCAA tournament, really good defensive squad, plays a really physical style of basketball that lends them to plenty of success in the Mountain West Conference. I think for Gonzaga to get a chance to play Boise State on the reg would be a really good bonus for them. Another regional game that I think would be fun for Boise area Zag fans to get a chance to see them play if they were playing in Boise, and also just a good game for Gonzaga to even host them, as well as a step above some of those kind of average to below average teams that Gonzaga periodically plays in that non-conference slate. We're going to close out the show with 6 more games from my hypothetical dream non-conference slate for Gonzaga, as asked by Eva on Discord as Mailbag Monday. But before we get to that, today's episode of the Locked On Zags podcast is brought to you by the Athletic Brewing Company. And now is your time for the Game Changer of the Week, brought to you by Athletic Brewing Company. Much like Shedeur Sanders for Colorado, Athletic Brewing has absolutely changed the non-alcoholic beer game. They make non-alcoholic beers that actually taste good. Sanders, for those who missed this, led Colorado to a comeback victory over rival Colorado State on Saturday, an epic college football game for Deion Primetime Sanders. They are now 3-0. The Buffaloes are. Athletic Brewing Company has completely changed the non-alcoholic brew game. They make non-alcoholic beers that actually taste good, full flavor and well-crafted, just like a full-strength beer. You can find Athletic Brewing Company's non-alcoholic beers at a store near you, or you can buy them online at athleticbrewing.com. First-time customers can use code LOCKEDON to get 15% off your first online order. That's code LOCKEDON at checkout for 15% off at athleticbrewing.com. Near beer. Exclusions and conditions do apply. Athletic Brewing Company, fit for all times. All right, folks, closing out the show here with the final 6 games in my hypothetical 12-game non-conference slate for the Gonzaga Bulldogs. We talked about playing some regional games with Eastern Washington, Washington State, and SeattleU, and for that matter, Boise State in the first segment, as well as Creighton and Duke. Now, I want to talk about a few other marquee opponents that Gonzaga could schedule in this dream scenario, starting with Arizona. You all knew Arizona was going to be on here, right? There's no possible way that if I was making a schedule, and if many of you are making a schedule, that you wouldn't put Mark Few versus Tommy Lloyd, Gonzaga versus Arizona, the Bulldogs versus the Wildcats on your schedule. This is a dream scenario, a dream matchup. Gonzaga and Arizona played each other a handful of times during the Sean Miller era. 2 premier West Coast college basketball programs, a lot of history between the two schools, even before Tommy Lloyd left Gonzaga after being there for 20 years as an assistant coach, spent the last 10 years as their associate head coach. He was a huge, critical part of Gonzaga's development, of their former success, of their current success. Takes the job at Arizona. Who could blame him for getting that opportunity? First coach in NCAA history to win 60 games in his first 2 seasons as a head coach. Tremendous success for Lloyd and the Wildcats right out of the chutes. And I think that they're going to continue to be great as they move into the Big 12 conference. And I think Gonzaga and Arizona playing each other should be something that happens. I get why they haven't been. I understand why they wanted to take a break. Umar Ballo's still at Arizona. Anton Watson still at Gonzaga. There's some history. There's players that these coaches have coached, that they've recruited. Like, it needed a bit of a breather. And I think we're done. Next year, Gonzaga and Arizona are both in the same multi-team event, so there's a real chance they play each other next season during the non-conference slate. And I think shortly after that, we will see Gonzaga and Arizona agree to a non-conference home series. Maybe I'm wrong, but I hope that is something that happens. And certainly if I was the decision maker, that's a game that I would put on the schedule every single year. Another game that I would always have on the schedule if it was up to me. And we got it for this year and next year, a 2-year home and home series between Gonzaga and the Aztecs of San Diego State out of the Mountain West Conference. I think this could be an elite West Coast rivalry. These are two of the best. And I said that with Arizona, and I've said that with a couple other programs as well. But to me, Gonzaga and San Diego State are two premier West Coast college basketball programs. And I think them playing each other on a year-to-year basis is good for the sport. It's good for the West Coast. It's good for college basketball. And I think we got it this year on the 29th in Spokane. We got it next year. It'll be down in San Diego, of course. And I think continuing that series is a really good way to continue to grow West Coast college basketball and show these two mid-major programs, for now at least, that they are capable of being the best basketball programs on the entire coast. Very excited to see that game this year and would love to see it continue for both these programs. Next up is Washington. Again, I already kind of teased that Washington was going to be on here. Not a big surprise, of course. This is the final year of the 4-year home and home series that Gonzaga and Washington agreed to. Of course, they used to play each other every year. There was a long period of time where they did not. They finally renewed the rivalry after a long gap, a long hiatus. It's been fun to have it back. UW has not been the program that they've been historically. Mike Hopkins had a few good years, but really hasn't quite kind of taken that program to the level that they're expected to be. I don't know how much longer Hopkins will be the head coach at that program, certainly as they get into the Big Ten and expectations are risen even higher. We'll see if they make a change there or not. But I do think UW has the ability to be a sleeping giant in a program that could quite easily turn things around with a new coach and a kind of a reinvigoration in the program and could be a premier powerhouse in the not too distant future. And I would love for Gonzaga and Washington to continue playing each other going forward. A couple more games. We got two more decent opponents, one more kind of the tune-up variety. We'll start with one of the better opponents. That is BYU. The Cougars, Mark Pope squad in the Big 12 Conference. Would love to see this one back on the schedule. And Mark Pope and Mark Few have both acknowledged wanting to continue playing this series. Whether that was just something they told the press, whether they are actually serious about it, all of that remains to be seen. BYU is not at the level that they were during a huge part of their tenure in the WCC. The BYU we saw last year was one of the worst versions of BYU that we saw during their decade in the West Coast Conference. But I think they're going to get better. Being in the Big 12 helps tremendously. Players are more likely to go to BYU because they know they're playing Kansas, they're playing Houston, they're playing, in a year from now, Arizona and all those schools. And so I just think that the BYU is going to improve. They're going to be a better basketball team in the near future, and I would love for Gonzaga to continue that. We've seen the rivalry. We saw Julian Strother hit that huge shot last year. These games are fun at the Kennel. They're fun in Provo. I think it'd be sad to not see this game continue. It doesn't need to be every year necessarily, but again, if I'm picking a schedule, you bet I'm putting BYU on that calendar. Last tune-up game that I would have for Gonzaga, this would be the game that's kind of scheduled at the end of December. Gonzaga usually plays kind of a tune-up game right before they get into WCC conference play. For me, give me Long Beach State. Give me the 49ers. Give me Dan Monson, the man who started this program, the head coach for the Slippers Still Fist, the 1999 run, Casey Calvary's runner, all of that. Monson's been coaching at Long Beach State for a very long time. Would love Few and Monson to coast against each other. Again, this would be a bit of a gimme game for Gonzaga. Long Beach State has been an adequate program in the Big West, but they haven't been super elite. They've had a few good years, but I think this would be a really fun game for Gonzaga from a storyline perspective, and I think it'd be fun for Gonzaga to get that chance to kind of go up against the coach who really helped be the catalyst for this program becoming what they have. And finally, as I said, Long Beach State would be that game right before the WCC play. That means we're putting a game on the calendar in February, like Gonzaga has done historically, especially before BYU was in the WCC. Now we're seeing it this year with Kentucky in February. But for me, give me Memphis. Give me Memphis. They used to play Gonzaga every year in that kind of February region. It was, of course, a John Calipari coach Memphis team. Calipari now at Kentucky. Part of the reason that game has come back at that time period. But I like Memphis, a quality basketball program. I like what Penny Hardaway's done with the team. We saw them nearly put the screws to Gonzaga in that NCAA tournament game back in 2022. And I think for Gonzaga, getting a chance to play Memphis every February, kind of in the middle of that WCC slate, an opponent that is better than most of the teams they play in the WCC, but not like a super premier team necessarily, I think is a good kind of way to keep Gonzaga on their toes as they go through that WCC slate. That's going to wrap us up for today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. If you have other thoughts, teams that you thought I would mention, teams you're surprised I didn't mention, teams that you would want to schedule, let me know in the comments on YouTube. Always love getting to see your guys' your insight, your expertise, your thoughts on those things. So definitely leave those comments, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button as well if you have not done so yet. Trying to get to 2,000 subscribers before the college basketball season. Let's get there before craziness. We got 3 weeks left. I think we got less than 20 subscribers to go. So if you haven't done so yet, just go hit that subscribe button on YouTube, follow along on Twitter, whatever it takes. We really appreciate all of your support as we get into the college basketball season. Folks, it's right around the corner. We are very, very close. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, as always, go Zags.